try to finish my heir apparent catalyst. I can tell you right now that I think this shit is way too grindy. Um, I got the catalyst quest like a few days ago, and I've had two different times that it would complete, and then it's like, oh no, you got more. So this is the third one I think that I've got to do. So yeah, I guess let's get into it. I'm going to head to the tower, grab some bounties. Let's see, we got some shit here I got to do, and or whatever. Looks like strikes give the extra progress today. And what's the strike playlist looking like? Shit, I still haven't finished the strikes? Shit, okay. Stasis, grounded, arc. Yeah, I might be doing a stasis build today. Shit's OP as fuck anyway. I don't know why I haven't been doing that. Oh, I gotta speak with Zavala. Alright. Let's go do that, I guess. But yeah, no, the game has I don't know, it has given me this level of stress relief that I had forgotten about. So like I just finished another video editing thing, and realized like I need to take a break and shoot some aliens in the face. I kind of have to, or I burn myself out. I don't know. This is my addiction now. So I've been trying to find other games. I tried to get into Outriders because I actually have friends who are playing that right now. Yeah, I don't know. Like I'm just so bad at it. It's not really fun. This game is super easy. I know some people struggle with it, obviously, like they said. With the platforming aspects, they do love their jumping puzzles. Let me just grab these. See what. I'll turn on the volume here.
Good. You're back.
Oh, it's an emblem that I don't have space for. So that one I hate. I remember when people got it and flaunted that shit was so horrible. I don't know why. This one's probably just as bad.
Congratulations on your performance in the Guardian Games. Your teammates are grateful for your efforts. That competitive fire, I know, will always show strong, whatever the outcome. However, now that we've united the tower with a much-needed break, it's back to business. Hidden reports from Vex sectors grow more troubling by the day. Whatever they're planning, I know we can overcome it, as long as we stand together.
Okay. Oh, okay. This says visit the podium.
A prepared soldier is a victorious soldier.
I'm probably going to do strikes today, so. Okay.
Enjoy the Guardian Games, my friend.
We'll come up here. Is that what you're talking about?
Good luck in the games.
Oh. That right there. Huh. It's not.
Come here and let me
My
guide
head is
you.
glowing while I'm standing on this. It's kind of weird. I can see on any of them. Okay. Let's see.
It's
Is that
just
it?
wonderful to be back. I missed you all so much.
Okay. Defeat guardians with machine guns in the daily focus playlist. Combatants. Oh, defeat combatants.
We have accomplished so much. Never forget that.
Collect. Okay. Cooperative spirit collected. Competitive
I
spirit.
imagine your life must be terribly
Defeat combatants
exciting.
with machine guns. Okay.
Experimenting with darkness is
Art.
a dangerous path. I don't know that it is worth the risk.
Okay.
The traveler will see us through this.
Okay. Well, I guess I should buy a competitor's card,
Oliva's got
and that
something
might
special
determine
for
what.
you.
But it always says stasis, though. So it doesn't matter what I do. I can always just
Do
put on
come back
stasis,
soon, Guardian.
and it'll work. All right. Uh, so it is saying I need void or stasis final blows and strikes. Melee, finish your final blows, grant additional progress. Okay. All right.
The feed went down just as they were going to say who won.
Finishers. Right there. Arc. Hand cannon. What's this? Sword? Yeah, I won't be doing that one because I got to do machine gun kills.
Guardian.
Let's see. Pulse rifle, sniper rifle might be a thing. Arc.
Take it. Don't get burned. I'll be pulling for you. I remember.
All right. What the fuck is? Oh, it's fucking fireworks up there.
Yes.
That's weird. Okay. Well. All right. Let me go look on my tablet for what I need. See, arc, pulse rifle. Yeah, I've been getting a lot of these third axioms. See, the highest light one I have has Feeding Frenzy Dragonfly, which I don't think I like. I want one with surplus. I know
The
that
shadows
much.
encroach all around us, Guardian.
So my hunter has a, what is this? Quick draw, unrelenting. No. See, the Titan has that one. Okay. Vault has a surplus Dragonfly.
What
Okay,
news?
that's better. At least has surplus. It's the only one with surplus, so that's gonna get.
Stay vigilant, Guardian. You've come too far to let the darkness win now.
Like, surplus is just so good. If you don't pass on that shit. All right. Surplus Dragonfly, and then I'll just infuse that into it. All right.
All warfare is founded on deception, Guardian. We cannot afford to take Kai's moment.
Yeah, Dragonfly spec is definitely going to go. Uh,
Rebuilding what we lost is not enough. We need more.
Vesper Radius is fun. Do that.
Indeed.
I'm infusing for 1 point of power. Just saying, this is dumb. Are you gonna? Just because I want everything to be maxed out. I mean, I don't even know if I have it on.
We can change things. I don't know what the Traveler's transformation means, but it brings the city hope. Together,
There we go.
there's nothing we can't accomplish.
Oh, Alright.
The next threat will come soon, Guardian. When it does, we will be ready. The shadows encroach all around us, Guardian, but our light still burns.
Okay.
Stay vigilant, Guardian. We've come too far to let the darkness win now.
Can make this the stacks on stacks. It's gonna be high energy fire.
You and I both know how Phantom is treated, but as commander, I must recognize the opportunity it presents.
Taking
Tell me you have
charge.
We must stay in the light. Remember that. We can change things. I know it. Together, there's nothing we can't accomplish. The city is depending on its guardian, now more than ever. We must stay in the light. Remember that.
Mm. All right, yeah, that's the right one.
Tell me you have something. shadows encroach all around us, Guardian, but our light still burns.
This is one I haven't used in a while. The Wither Horde. All right, yeah, we're good here. I could change this to art, but yeah, this one gives me more options.
We have much to discuss.
Let me just change this to
Let's get to work.
all right, yeah, let's just do this. I'm fucking launcher scav. Probably need a machine gun over that. And
Keep me apprised of Keitel's actions, Guardian. A truce and a trust are not the same thing. Let's get to work.
all right. It took me a while. It's a playing destiny, as they say. All right, let's go and get this shit done. Took me long enough to figure it out. God damn, it took like 30 minutes to figure out what the fuck I was going to put on to do a strike. But there you go. Relaxation. I got 30 minutes. Maybe put some music on. Although, yeah, I think I got one of my videos banned for that. But let's listen to.
Learned it, virtually all of it, implicitly, and so much of what we care about and what we are outraged by, and all of our collisions with other human beings, it's just all governed by stuff that's outside of us that we have, we or our ancestors have tacitly agreed is important, or rules worth following, or a taboo to break. So anyway,
Yeah,
that context.
I couldn't agree more. One of the things that fascinates me about culture is that it's this great puzzle. It's omnipresent. It's all around us, like 24/7, but it's totally invisible. Like we really take it for granted. We're not thinking about it. It's really an unbelievable thing that I think you talked about it even indirectly. I'm a big fan of your app, Waking Up. Actually, when I hear your voice now, it's a little conflicted because I'm like, well, should I be meditating right now? Like I'm talking to Sam, but there's this people kind of walking around in a spell, without realizing that they have been socialized to follow certain values and norms. And in my work and in Harry's tradition of cultural research, some of these norms and values have an important function. Like they've been evolving to help groups adapt to certain ecological and historical contingencies, and they make sense to some extent. And so I think the most important part of, the goal of cross-cultural psychology is to try to make those codes more visible and to help people understand where they come from and also how we might negotiate them. So that's the only thing I would sort of differ with your perspective. I think we can, once we understand these codes, I think we can try to change them when needed. We can try to pivot. I'm not saying it's easy, but
I didn't mean to imply that we couldn't do that. Yeah, I'm all about changing the culture when it seems non-optimal. before we get into all of the trade-offs here, what are norms? How do you think about norms?
Yes, so social norms are these unwritten rules of behavior. Sometimes they get more formalized in terms of codes and laws. We follow them constantly. For example, most of us wear clothes when we leave the house. We don't steal food from people's plates at restaurants. We don't sing loudly or dance in libraries, most of us. And we do these things because they help our society function. And in a lot of ways, social norms are this incredible human invention because they help us to predict each other's behavior. They help us to coordinate. In fact, if you just do a thought experiment and think about a world without social norms, it quickly becomes obvious that we couldn't function. Societies, organizations, families, we'd all collapse. And, my work has been focused on a distinction that actually was first discussed indirectly by Herodotus in his book, The Histories, later picked up by Pietro Pelto, an anthropologist in the 60s. And the gist is that although all cultures, we think all cultures have social norms, some cultures abide by social norms much more strictly. They're what we call tight cultures. Other groups are much more loose. They have more relaxed attitude toward rules. They have much more permissiveness. And so I've been trying to understand this distinction of tight and loose, not just across societies, but also within nations, even within households, and across history, and why they evolve and what consequences they have, what trade-offs they confer to human groups. So that's the kind of gist of what we've been looking at.
Yeah, well, there's a basic trade-off here that certainly covers most, and this is one you discussed toward the end of your book, which is this trade-off between order and freedom, personally and collectively. And, I think we'll want to talk about how we imagine kind of an optimal strategy or disposition here. But whatever's optimal, there's no question that there's just a stark fact of trade-off, right? Where there are cases where you really want more freedom, but then there are situations where that freedom is coming at an unacceptable price and you want to be able to impose more order. And so there's a sort of a flexibility response here that I think we're going to land on, and you describe this as a kind of ambidexterity with respect to tight and loose. But you sent me a quiz that you have on your website before we started here, and I took it. And do you want to guess where I fall, or should I just confess where I fall on your
I'll let you tell us. I'm not really sure I could guess totally, but where did you fall?
So I got a 74, which is moderately tight.
I was going to guess that. I didn't want to say that, but I was going to guess that.
Where are you? What did you get on your own quiz?
I'm moderately loose, and I'm constantly negotiating with my moderately tight husband, who's an attorney. And we have lots of interesting negotiations around our household in terms of order and openness, and what domains need to be tight and what domains need to be loose. We can get maybe back to that in terms of negotiation of tight loose. But were you surprised when you took the quiz? Is that what you anticipated?
No. I was, as I was kind of going through the questions, I was kind of anticipating their logic, and we could dissect it as a psychometric instrument. But I think I may be an odd use case for some of the logic of that quiz, because there were clearly questions I was answering in a very tight way and others not so much. And it's more based on, some peculiarities about me, which actually relate to waking up and meditation and other related. So you have a bunch of questions there, like, I can control my emotions when I need to, or something like that, right? Obviously that is in fact very true of me, but it's very true of me based on my fairly idiosyncratic focus on meditation and mindfulness and etc. So I don't know if I deranged your instrument there by having my weird background, but anyway, I do feel like I'm someone who is fairly attuned to norm violations, and it's not to say that I don't violate other people's norms too. It's like there are norms that I think should be rewritten, and I do a fair amount of that attempted work in that direction on this podcast. But where there's a norm that either seems obviously good, or I haven't examined it, so I'm presuming it to be good by default, I think I'm on the tight side of thinking, okay, that's not something you should violate. And whether it's somebody cutting in line in front of you or whatever, it's something that I feel like I notice the downside risk of. I think the stakes for maintaining norms are quite a bit higher than most people realize. And this is something you get into when you talk about how tight societies and honor cultures view their norms. Like perhaps you want to say something about the way that the American South views politeness, say. And that's something that actually kind of resonates with me more than you would expect, given that I've spent about 5 minutes in the South.
I want to just back up and make a couple of points. So the Tight Loose Mindset quiz, which any of your audience can take online, is actually based on the paper we published in Science. And I wanted to emphasize that there's not one. I don't like to call people tight or loose individuals, because that's kind of a levels of analysis problem that's kind of plagued the literature on culture. The way I study tight loose is that certain ecological and historical factors create the need for order and predictability, and that's what strict norms provide in those contexts. So if you have a lot of threat in a society or in an organization or in a household or even as an individual, then abiding by norms is actually a good strategy. It helps to avoid in groups defectors that can cause a lot of chaos. And so big picture is that what we found is that countries and groups that have a lot of collective threat, whether it's from mother nature, like chronic natural disasters, resource scarcity, or human nature, number of invasions on your territory in the last 100 years, for example, from our paper, those countries tend to have stricter rules. Not all of them. Not all tight cultures have a lot of threat. Not all loose cultures are an easy street. But in general, there seems to be a connection between threat and tightness, both in field data and lab experiments and also in computational models. But at the individual level, the way we study this is to see, okay, what individual differences help people adapt to the strength or weakness of norms in their culture. And so in that paper, we studied things like self-monitoring. Like we predicted and found that tight cultures have people who tend to be higher on self-monitoring. They also tend to be higher on prevention focus. It comes from Troy Higgins. The people who are worried about not making mistakes. They like more order. And so these are a suite of individual differences that help people to reinforce the norm strength in their environment. And, on the flip side, people that are in contexts that have less threat can afford to not really have as much impulse control. They can be more risk-taking. They can be more tolerant of ambiguity. And so tight loose is a mindset at the level. The metaphor I write about in the book, taking it from Valerie Lupick, is the order versus chaos Muppets. So you can think about Bert and like Kermit the Frog as, kind of order Muppets. And they tend to notice rules and they are managing their impulses and they like a lot of order. That's the tight mindset. On the flip side, you have Ernie and Cookie Monster that are kind of the chaos Muppets. They're less likely to notice rules and they're more kind of impulsive. But in any event, these are general metaphors. But I just wanted to mention that the quiz itself comes from scales, and the items that you were answering come from that data. And I think the important point here is also that it doesn't mean that we're always at our default. In fact, what's really remarkable is we can tighten or loosen very quickly depending on the situation. When you're in a library or a funeral, we tighten up. We tend to start following rules and manage our impulses to a much greater extent. Or a movie theater, most of us. When we're in a public park or in a party, these are looser situations. Goffman actually, the famous sociologist, who probably said everything about anything we need to know about. He talked about tight versus loose situations. And I think, so I just wanted to point out that, like a lot of individual differences, they're dynamic. They could change based on the situation. And we don't even notice it. We don't notice that that's the case. In the science paper, I'll just mention one more thing. We rank ordered situations of how tight or loose they were around the world, asking people how appropriate 15 different behaviors, like arguing or eating or singing, how appropriate are these across 15 different situations? And the rank order of tight loose in situations, meaning that tight situations have a more restricted range of behaviors that seems permissible, was identical around the world. There wasn't a single flip of situations. But what we found was that in general, in tight cultures, there were tighter situations. Like what needs to be in a public park is more strict in Pakistan, for example, than in the US. So anyway, that's a broad kind of introduction. The only other thing I want to say is that I'd love to peer into your brain and see, how do you react to norm violations? What's happening when your brain or anyone's brain, what's happening when, you're witnessing people doing strange things? Like, Michelle's in the library and she's studying is a reasonable thing, but Michelle's in the library and she's shouting is a norm violation. And we developed some new paradigms to try to understand what's happening in the brain as people are witnessing norm violations, as compared to linguistic violations, like Michelle is having coffee with dog, which is huge literature on that, kind of M400, they call it response in neuroscience, is negative deflection, 400 seconds after stimulus onset. And it's an incongruity, but, in some research that we've done, trying to look at neuroscience and tight loose, we can start seeing, that there are big individual differences in how people are reacting in the central parietal area, in the frontal area. There are cultural differences in how people react in terms of EEG responses to norm violations. So it's kind of an exciting frontier. What's fascinating to me is that social norms are so important, but there's so little research on neuroscience of social norms. There's, of course, work on economic behavior, fairness, but not on the kind of norms that we've been talking about. Anyway, so I forgot what you were asking me about.
I'll steer us back to the second half of that question, but actually you mentioned Goffman, who I don't think you discussed in the book, but Goffman has always been fascinating to me because he, for those who haven't read him, he's got some great books, Interaction, Ritual, Asylum. And he did a lot of work focusing on the mentally ill and the difference in how we bound the categories of human behavior, in particular face-to-face behavior, around the concepts of sanity and insanity. And the one course cut at this that he introduces, to not have any boundary between how you behave in public and how you behave in private is a fairly diagnostic for mental illness. And that's what we notice about people who are mentally ill. They're often doing things that sane people would do in private, but they're just doing them in contexts that, where this private behavior is on display and it seems totally inappropriate.
Yeah.
And there are these kind of rituals of interaction that he described in terms of what necessarily happens when people come into each other's presence and know or should know that they're being observed by others, and that kind of hall of mirrors effect and the pressure that imposes on or should impose on normal psychology is something he discusses really beautifully. But if to come back to culture, there are tighter cultures, and perhaps you can pick any example you want to describe. You mentioned many in the book, but everything from Singapore to ancient Sparta to the American South by comparison with the rest of the U.S. And viewed from outside, viewed from a looser point of view, the emphasis on following certain norms, not swearing, say, in the South, or being polite, being elaborately polite, even when there's not necessarily all that much goodwill between the parties. All of this is viewed as fairly high stakes, and violations there are viewed as very quickly provocations to violence. And when viewed from loose cultures, the stakes are just non-obvious. Like, what's wrong with swearing or saying something inappropriate or not being polite or trespassing on a person's imagined sense of honor when you don't view yourself in those terms. And I'm certainly American enough to be horrified at the extreme versions of all this. And when you find out that in Singapore you can be jailed for even bringing chewing gum into the country, right, and killed for bringing marijuana into the country. I mean, this just seems like a Orwellian dystopia. But it's the knock-on effects of being that rigid. One of the knock-on effects of being that rigid is to close the door to a lot of unpleasantness that we're trying to figure out how to clean up in our society some other way. And so there's an interesting, again, we're just in the domain of trade-offs here. But anyway, give us a snapshot of the tight-loose difference at the level of society, perhaps comparing a couple of cultures here.
Yeah, so, and as I mentioned earlier, all cultures have tight and loose elements, but we can classify countries in terms of where they veer tight on the continuum. And places like Japan, Singapore, Austria, to some extent Germany, tend to veer tighter as compared to places like the US in general, Spain, Brazil, Italy. And, like you mentioned, a lot of times people are kind of horrified when they look at practices in cultures that have the opposite or different code without realizing that, they have their own liabilities. Often the strength of another culture is their own liability and vice versa. And just as an example, we call this the order versus openness trade-off. And cultures that are tight tend to, generally speaking, have less crime. They have more monitoring by police, by God. Ara Narayan, my colleague at UBC, would say that people who are monitored are people who are good people. They're following rules, at least publicly. And they also have more synchrony. They have more uniformity. Even in clocks in city streets, I talked about in the book, we actually published this in a science paper. In tight cultures, when you look at clocks around city streets, they pretty much say the same exact thing. They're highly synchronized. Whereas clocks in city streets in loose cultures are really off by quite a bit. You're not totally sure what time it is in places like Brazil or Greece. And tight cultures, as another indication of order, have more self-regulation in general. They are places where people are monitoring their impulses more at the national level. That translates into less debt, translates into less obesity, controlling for lots of factors, and also alcoholism and recreational drug use. And so you can think about tight cultures more in the market on order, and loose cultures struggle with order. They have higher crime in general. They have less synchrony, they're less coordinated, less discipline. So they have a host of self-regulation, let's call them problems or challenges. But loose cultures, on a wide variety of entities, are much more open. They have more tolerance, relatively speaking, in terms of attitudes, both explicit and implicit, towards people that are different. In one experiment we did, we even set our RAs around the world to see whether people react differently to people who look stigmatized. That's one of these crazy field experiments. I had my RAs wear fake facial warts on their faces, or tattoos and rings in another condition, or in another condition, they weren't wearing anything, just the normal face. And they went back to their home countries to ask for help in city streets or in stores. And, when people were not wearing anything on their face, there was no difference in how much they were helped around the world. But when they were wearing these really strange, tattoos and facial warts, they were helped far more in loose cultures. There's just more openness, people who are different. There's a whole host of, getting back to Goffman, issues with being stigmatized in tight cultures. And you can talk about that if you'd like. But that's, really where loose cultures corner the market on openness. They also tend to be more creative. So in large-scale crowdsourcing contests of creativity, it's really clear that people from loose cultures are more likely to enter creativity contests, and they're more likely to win them. So, the big picture is that tight cultures struggle with openness, but they are really disciplined and have a lot of order. And I think we could talk about this later when it comes to COVID, but, this kind of presents this evolutionary mismatch where, certain traits might be really great in some contexts, but not in other contexts. And this begs the question of how do we kind of pivot when we need to, when the traits that we naturally are evolved to the context that they're useful in, like looseness is great for creativity and innovation in contexts where there's not much threat in general. How adaptive is that to context of collective threat like COVID?
Right.
So I want to mention also, these are generalities. Like clearly there's going to be some differences, but we have found this order versus openness trade-off both at the national level, at the state level in the US, rank ordering the 50 states on tight loose. Others have found it in China, rank ordering the 30 plus provinces in China in terms of the measures we developed. Organizations tend to have the same trade-off. We could talk later, I'm working with the Navy to try to help them become more ambidextrous, even though they need to veer tight, and et cetera. So the tight loose trade-off tends to be something that constitutes kind of a fractal pattern coming from physics, this repeated kind of pattern across levels. But again, we have these strong stereotypes around what's good, what's correct, what's objective. To us, looking at another culture, really, we get this moral outrage. And often, if we step back, like you said, the extremes are bad anywhere. But like if we look at the gum example that you gave, Americans are kind of horrified that why can't you bring a lot of gum into the country of Singapore? And, actually it has some kind of historical basis. In the late 80s, people were chewing gum. It's a very highly populated, high population density context, about 20,000 people per square mile. And people were chewing gum. And I guess, as a lot of us do, we throw it on the floor. And it was causing this massive problem throughout Singapore with gum and wads of gum, like blocking sensors on trains and elevators. And Lee Kuan Yew, who, if you read his autobiography, the dude was really a cross-cultural psychologist at heart. He talks about how Singapore has a lot of threat and that, we need to sacrifice some freedom and in order to kind of come together and coordinate. And he talked about gum as being one of these issues. Like, guys, we live in a very small place and this gum is causing a big problem. And we better just kind of ban this tasty treat because we have so many mouths per capita. And I'm sure there was some resistance to that, I would guess. But overall, I think when we start looking at these differences with some eye to the ecology of countries, we might have a little bit more empathy
Yeah, actually, there's a distinction that you make in the book, which is a little hard to understand quickly. So perhaps you can spell it out, because it's easy to see this tight, loose distinction as analogous to or identical to the distinction between being politically conservative and politically liberal. But those are not. It's not the same axis in your view. How do you differentiate liberal and conservative here politically?
Yeah. Well, I think social norms, are at a different level of analysis. Individual differences in conservatism and liberal, attitudes tend to be individual differences. They might be adaptive in certain contexts, but clearly you'll find conservatives living in looser states. You'll find liberals living in conservative states and so forth. So I think that we can think about them as separate but interrelated. That clearly conservatives probably like to be in contexts where there's strict social norms. They also have domains in which they're quite loose. And likewise, liberals, might find themselves enjoying living in these states, but they also, while have a lot of domains that are, basically loose, also have some domains on which they would fall tight. So I see them as like interrelated at different levels of analysis.
Actually, COVID is a very good mechanism for dissecting out the difference between you look at the conservative bias against mask wearing, say. They don't want this new norm of mask wearing imposed on them based on their underlying beliefs about epidemiology here. And we can talk about the problem of information and disinformation. But yeah, that's an example of people who are disproportionately conservative rebelling against the tightness that's coming to them from the political left in our country.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the big evolutionary mismatches, of the century. Much of the work in the social sciences has found that conservatives prior to COVID are much more sensitive to threat. I'm sure you've seen some of this work. It's both surveys, it's experiments, it's neuroscience data. So when COVID hit and we see that conservatives are the ones that are actually resisting because of that this is the real threat, really makes us realize that there's a strong propensity for people, particularly conservatives, to follow the leader. And what we know during times of threat now is that that threat signal can get hijacked. Mm-hmm. It can get distorted, it can get manipulated, and if it does, then groups don't tighten. And I think that's where we see the pandemic, the switch with conservatives, to me makes sense. In a context where it's a germ, it's invisible, it's kind of easier to ignore as compared to warfare or terrorism. If you have, combined with the abstract nature of the threat, and you have leaders who are telling you don't worry about it, then conservatives, their kind of normal propensity to be threat sensitive goes basically out the window. And that's been the big, kind of story of COVID.
Actually, there's another piece to it, which is deeply ironic or depressing, depending on your view, but they're sensitized to the threat around this, but they're disproportionately sensitized to the threat of the vaccine.
Yeah.
Basically, we have something like 40% of the country, it seems, that is quite sanguine about the prospect of catching COVID, but quite averse to getting vaccinated against COVID. They're basically running a head-to-head trial between the disease and the vaccine for the disease and deciding the disease is better.
Yeah, it's just remarkable. And there's some interesting new data coming out that a lot of this has to do with signaling, that if you hear from Republican leaders that vaccine is okay and it's good, then you'll see people in the Conservative Party starting to veer towards their intention of getting the vaccine. When they hear that same message from liberals, of course, it backfires. But I think this is just yet another example of the power of social norms. Humans are social creatures, and I think that's where people have been trying to get Republicans to get out there and be role models and say, this is important, because we do know that people are starting to listen to that. It's just that we don't see it that often.
Yeah, well, maybe there's more to say about COVID when we talk about how we want to try to steer the ship in light of what we understand about norms. I'm struck by how important norms are and how it's not totally obvious where they get their power from. You can think of certain norm violations, certainly in a religious context, there are norm violations that are absolutely fatal to a person's reputation and or even to their lives in a theocracy. But they're even in the context of a very loose society, there are norm violations which really are an extraordinarily big deal, and it's not totally clear why or what would be optimal here. I'm thinking one example that came to mind was the misadventures of Jeffrey Toobin, the New Yorker writer. He was on a Zoom. Most people probably know this. He was on a Zoom call with his colleagues who were other famous writers, disproportionately. One must think very liberal, and he thought they were taking a 10-minute break apparently and started masturbating, and to the uniform horror of the people who were still on the call with him. Originally his statement was he thought his camera was off, or it sounded like he didn't actually know how to use Zoom very well, to his everlasting disadvantage here, but basically he masturbated in front of his colleagues, clearly making him he was not some boorish ogre who was imposing this sexual harassment style on his colleagues. I mean, he clearly thought he was in private and was wrong about that. And yet it has proved to be a norm violation without any intent so catastrophic that one wonders if he will ever be heard from again. So it's, it was certainly career wrecking and at minimum life deranging. And on some basic level, I look at it as he was just very unlucky to be so confused as to have inadvertently violated this norm. It's easy to see how CNN and the New Yorker wouldn't be eager at this point to rehire him because, he's done himself and them by association massive brand damage. But it's opposite ends of some kind of